On behalf of management of Jaslok Hospital and GPA, I wish you all a very good afternoon and welcome you all at this popular class of GPA. Friends, some of you might not be knowing that this weekly class was started more than 45 years back, and I think this is the oldest recorded CME class for GPs in Mumbai. Not only Mumbai, probably it is India. Thanks to members of GPA for their unique hunger for knowledge. Today, we have with us one of the pillars of scientific activities of GPA, Dr. Preeti Bhargav, who is practicing at Andheri West. She is actively associated with all academic activities of GPA. I request her to moderate today's program. Dr. Preeti Bhargav.
Thank you, Dr. Dholakia. I welcome everybody to this webinar today. Nothing can stop the truly inspired and motivated person. And Dr. Dholakia is one such mentor who has ensured that the CMEs go on in spite of the lockdown. Of course, we are equally thankful to Jaslok Hospital for their continuous support in this endeavor of General Practitioners Association. Let me welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Aabha Nagral. She is a hepatologist at Jaslok. Welcome, Dr. Aabha. We can go ahead with the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Preeti. Thank you, Dr. Dholakia. It's been always talking for the GPA and the GPA participants. I'm sorry about this hiccup here. I had to reload my Zoom, but I hope now you can see my screen. Not just my face, the screen. You're able to see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think without more delay, I would like to start. Actually, in a way, pros webinars, we are not meeting physically, we are not having any conferences. But in a way, we've been able to learn much more through these. I see much more attendance in webinars now than what we used to see physically. And maybe this will be a way to go for the future. So my topic for the day is how do I care for my liver? And before I go on to the actual care, I would like to give some brief about the liver, some brief functions of the liver. We are aware that liver is one of the important, or probably one of the most important organs in the body. You know of many Hindi movies where the word jigar is used and is considered equivalent to heart. Mera jigar kahan kho gaya and things like that. So we know that jigar plays a very important role. It produces proteins, mainly albumin, all the clotting factors except part of factor 8. It also produces bile, and we know that bile, which is produced in the liver, is extremely important for fat absorption and for absorption of fat soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. The bile is stored in the gallbladder. The liver also stores components of food, protein, fat, carbohydrates. When you eat something, and we eat a lot of crap in our food day to day, this food gets digested, absorbed into the portal circulation, and the first stop is the liver. So the liver detoxifies the food which comes through the portal vein from the gut directly. So it is the first stop, and that's where it gets detoxified, and then the purified blood from the liver goes to the heart and into the circulation to all the organs. It also regulates function. So in short, the liver has many important functions. There are many causes of liver disease, but the important ones are fatty liver, viruses, alcohol, and drugs. Most people associate liver with alcohol, but I must say here, alcohol has taken a back seat. It is, of course, a very common problem of liver disease, but the one which we are facing today is the fatty liver. There are many other causes: autoimmune, malignancy, genetic causes. Even a 6-month-old child can suffer from liver cirrhosis, but really, these are less common, and I would like to focus on the common ones today. What about fatty liver disease? Now we know that when you say fatty liver on ultrasound, it's something which we would not give much importance to in the past, maybe 20 years ago or 10 years or decade ago. We know that early stages of alcohol liver disease has causes of fatty liver, drugs, and many metabolic other conditions in children can cause fatty liver. But today, when we talk of fatty liver, by and large, we mean non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or NAFLD. And NAFLD can initially be just seen as fat in areas which you can see fat in the, or you can have steatitis, which is inflammation that can progress to cirrhosis. So basically, fatty hepatitis C and become the #1 indication for liver transplants all over the world. So really, fatty liver disease is what we are dealing with day in and day out. And what is this fatty liver disease or NAFLD? It's not merely a liver disease. It's actually a surrogate marker for the metabolic syndrome. We are all familiar with the metabolic syndrome. It is a syndrome of insulin resistance where you have obesity, dyslipidemia, hypertension, hypothyroidism, even sleep apnea is very much a part of this disease. And one quick way of diagnosing metabolic syndrome in the OPD is ask your patient's spouse whether he or she snores at night. And if you do have a loud snoring, there's a good chance that you have sleep apnea and have a metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is very common, and fatty liver disease is one part and a surrogate marker of the metabolic syndrome. So it's not an isolated condition in itself. This is a study from the All India Institute where they looked at patients who had abnormal liver enzymes, and they found that the commonest cause of fatty liver disease was now non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which is the same NASH, and almost a third of them had fatty liver disease as the commonest cause of abnormal liver enzymes. Now, what about fatty liver disease in India overall? So different parts of India have looked at populations to see what is the prevalence of fatty liver. And in all these studies, males are much more compared to females. So that's one. Secondly, urban and rural, there's no major difference. And that was a surprise. We would have thought that people in the urban population would have more fatty liver given their diet, lifestyles, etc. But no, between rural and urban, there's not much of a difference. And overall, one could say that 1/5 of the Indian population, 244 million people, would have a fatty liver. Now, is it that all who are obese alone have a fatty liver? And this was a very elegant study from Kolkata, which looked at a rural population, and they looked at the non-obese population. These were patients whose BMIs were less than 25. In India, we define a BMI up to 23 as normal, between 23 to 25 as overweight, and above 25 it goes on to the obesity spectrum. So they found that even those who had a low BMI, 3/4 of them, 75% of them had a fatty liver, and therefore the term lean NASH. So that means that just because you are thin does not protect you from having a fatty liver. You could still have a fatty liver, and it will still have the implications which one has in a patient who is obese and has a fatty liver. Now, this is the natural history of fatty liver. Steatosis is fat in the liver. When it becomes inflamed, it is NASH. From NASH to cirrhosis, that means from just inflammation to scarring, over a period of 8 years, 1/4 of them will get scarred livers. And in those who develop cirrhosis, another 8 years, another 1/4 of them will develop decompensated liver disease in the form of ascites, varicose bleed, jaundice, etc. And then, finally, it is death. Now, the interesting thing is that death, the commonest cause of death in patients with fatty liver disease is not the liver disease itself. That again goes to prove that it is just a surrogate marker for the metabolic syndrome. The commonest causes of death in these patients are cardiovascular and malignancies. And it is not only hepatocellular carcinomas that they are prone to, like any other patients of cirrhosis, but they are also prone to other malignancies like colonic malignancies, prostatic, breast malignancies, etc. So fatty liver disease The commonest cause of death is cardiovascular and malignancy, and liver-related death is only seen in 1 to 2% of the population due to fatty liver disease. Now, if you look at the statistics of obesity in India, you will find that more than 50% are above the BMI of 23. This is across India, and again, this is a very worrying trend. It is something which we always thought affected the West, but it is very much an Indian problem as well. So how do you manage patients of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? It's a multidisciplinary approach. We know that patients go quickly to the bariatric surgeon, get surgery done, want to look thin, but it's not only cosmesis. There are so many issues related to fatty liver, and that cannot be the first stop. One has to consult a dietitian. Very important is a psychologist, because your eating behavior is controlled by the brain, not the stomach. And then there are a whole lot of people who are involved in managing patients of fatty liver. You need a physiotherapist for exercise. So you have somebody called a metabolic physician. So I don't want a patient of fatty liver disease coming to me only for the fatty liver, going to the endocrinologist for diabetes, to a physician or a cardiologist for hypertension, and so on and so forth. The patient should be ideally managed by a physician who can manage all these aspects of metabolic syndrome, and that is the term metabolic physician. We have some in the city, and this is a popular thing, popular, I would say, field to take up in the West. Many metabolic physicians now exist there, and they purely manage these patients, which is a huge patient population. The hepatobiliary surgeon comes much later when these patients need a liver transplant, and that would be something which we want to talk about and avoid. And of course, there will be there has to be a good interaction between all these to manage the patient well. How does one prevent progression? Lifestyle modifications, very important, which will mean weight reduction. We'll talk about that. Weight reduction is mainly through diet, to some extent through exercise. There is no role. There's a lot of thing in the market about various things which are used, various vibrators, you name it, and it's there. Colon cleansing, herbal supplements. Herbal Life is one supplement I want to talk about, very popular. And there was a study from Kochi, which actually showed that patients who took Herbal Life had liver toxicity, and some patients even had fulminant liver failure. So really, there are many herbal supplements in the market, and one should abstain from using them because they will give you quick fixes. They will promise you quick fixes, but they're never quick fixes. And they are in fact in a way detrimental. And there are a whole lot of drugs which are used for treatment once there is inflammation and fibrosis, but we really don't want to get there. I'll not really discuss drugs because the topic today is how do I care for my liver. So I will focus more on the lifestyle problems. We know we are all addicted to fast foods. Western diet has been one of the factors which has caused really an epidemic of fatty liver disease in the country. There is lack of exercise. It's worse during the pandemic. We are all addicted to social media, and one very popular pastime during this pandemic has been trying out various recipes, uploading them on Instagrams, showing nice pictures of the food which has been cooked. And so many people we are coming across who gained weight during this pandemic. There's very little motivation for exercise and sports, and really there's really no excuse to gain weight during this pandemic. And I would just go through this in a minute. So what are we aiming at? We are aiming at reducing 5 to 10% of the weight to reduce the amount of fat in the liver. So if one has to do it gradually, slowly, scientifically, it has to be just half a kilo to 1 kilo a week, which also may not be very easy. Now we know that fatty liver disease runs in families. So in a way, there have been genes which have been associated with fatty liver disease. There's a gene called PNPLA3, and most drugs are based on this use of this gene in the pathogenesis of fatty liver disease. So in a way, fatty liver disease is a genetic disease. We looking at modifying the environment. So it's a combination of genetics and environment. What we can change is not the genetics. What we can change is the environment. We can reduce weight. So there are certain recommendations. You take a low kilocalorie per kg, but the important thing is ideal body weight. Don't go by your weight, the ideal body weight, and I'll just come to it in a minute. Carbohydrates should be about 40%, increase the protein intake and reduce the fat intake, and definitely the saturated fat intake. Saturated fat is what we see in everything, burgers, pastries, etc. These ready-made processed fast foods which we eat are mostly containing saturated fat. Now, as I said, it is the ideal weight, and you can just Google ideal weight. It is based on age, gender, and height. Put in the terms, put in the values, and calculate it. There are various formulae which are given. So, for a person who is age 57, female, with a height of 160, the ideal weight, depending on the formula, could be between 52 to 57 kilos. So, check the ideal weight and then decide how many calories one needs, and then one can always count the calories, and there are various charts on your mobile and Google to calculate the calorie intake which you have every day. So what do you reduce? You reduce saturated fats, which I mentioned, carbohydrates, and fructose in a way is detrimental. So does that mean we don't eat fruit? No, fruits has many other good qualities. It has antioxidants, it has a lot of fiber, so fruit is good. So how do we reduce fructose? Reduce the intake of fruit juices, especially the ready-made fruit juices which are processed, which have artificial sweeteners, and which are minus all the fiber and the good things which are there when you actually eat raw fruit. Individualize the diet rather than following Atkins and keto and various named diets. Individualize the diet to the needs and to the food habits of the patient, and that is what works better than giving a fixed diet. Now, this whole controversy about small frequent meals, or whether you follow intermittent fasting, the Dikshit diet or the Devekar diet. So there are so many fads and so many views on this. I really don't aim to discuss all these. But one thing I can say is whatever has been advised, adhere to that. Try to modify your own day-to-day diet rather than going to some fancy name diets, and definitely avoid crash dieting. It's not only not effective, you'll gain back the weight in no time, but crash dieting also causes a fatty liver. So it will actually worsen your fatty liver disease. Now here's a picture which I have shown, which is what you call a Mediterranean diet. So it's rich in fruits, vegetables, fish, which give omega-3 fatty acids, olives, which are very good, and nuts. So this is one diet which has been shown to be good for fatty liver disease and known to reduce the incidence of inflammation and fibrosis in those who have fatty liver disease. Now, this is what I was alluding to, that one often tends to snack, saying that you're skipping meals, so you're having a smaller meal, a snack. But really, snacks are not great. A snack can be sometimes more than a meal. When you eat a samosa, it's not one. When you eat a vada pav, often it's not one. So really, snacking is not a good idea and should be avoided. And you have one large samosa, 350 calories. If you have intense exercise of swimming by a breaststroke for 30 minutes, you're going to burn only 260 calories. So you have to really think that you're not going to easily burn away the calories you've had in the samosa by doing intense exercise, and you'll really need to work out much more to burn the calories of what you've gained by eating the snacks, which should be completely avoided. What about exercise? Now, there are two forms of exercise. You have cardio and resistance exercises. Cardio is where you walk on a treadmill, you run fast, you increase your heart rate. Basically, you increase the work of breathing and you burn more calories. So here you talk of various intensities of cardio. You have moderate intensity, which 3 times a week for 45 minutes is good enough. And you have a high intensity, which for a smaller amount of time, 30 minutes is good enough. Now, this is based on the heart rate you want to achieve. So an intensity of an exercise is proportional to the heart rate. So a high intensity exercise, you will achieve a higher target heart rate compared to a moderate intensity exercise. So in a moderate intensity, you will have maximum heart rate into 0.6. For high intensity, it will be 0.85. And how do you calculate the maximum heart rate? It is 220 minus age in years. So if you're 50 years, your maximum heart rate is 170. You want to do a high intensity exercise, 170 into 0.85 will be your target heart rate. Suppose it comes to 130, you need to achieve 130 beats per minute of heart rate to say that you have achieved the target heart rate to be effective over 30 minutes. Whereas resistance exercises are exercises which increase your muscle mass. And the whole idea of exercising in fatty liver disease is to reduce your fat mass, especially the visceral fat mass, and increase the muscle mass. So you may not reduce weight, but because you are increasing muscle mass, so that also is giving you weight, but you're actually increasing muscle and reducing fat in your body. And even in the lockdown, if you Google workouts on your computer, you will get so many workouts which can be done at home. So really no excuse to say that I put on so much weight because I could not step down for exercise. Uh, Increase in exercise, as I said, may not improve your weight, but it improves cardiovascular fitness, hypertension, dyslipidemia, and the fat inflammation in the liver. Now, this is a very important chart. So if you lose 3% of the weight, the fat in the liver goes away. If you lose 5% to 7%, the inflammation reduces. And if you lose more than 10% of the weight, the scarring of the liver actually goes down. So theoretically, we can actually reverse cirrhosis, which is nothing but an extreme form of fibrosis. So initially, we were always taught that cirrhosis is an irreversible process, but now we know that cirrhosis is really, in a way, reversible. And if you lose significant amount of weight, the fibrosis in the liver can actually regress. What about COVID and the liver? So COVID has been associated with liver dysfunction. About 50% of patients with liver dysfunction, with COVID will have liver dysfunction, and those who have liver dysfunction have a severe form of COVID. What about those who already have a fatty liver disease and then develop COVID? So one thing we have seen is that those who have fatty liver disease have a higher incidence of fatty liver disease, have a higher incidence of getting more severe liver disease if they develop COVID. And if you have an underlying cirrhosis due to any cause, the COVID disease tends to be more severe. So in short, you will develop much more severe COVID disease if you have an underlying liver disease, whether it is fatty liver disease or whether it is cirrhosis, and therefore, again, more reason to not put on weight. Also, there are patients like transplant patients, patients who are on immunosuppression for autoimmune liver disease. We need to be careful in these patients because of immunosuppression. They are more susceptible, and we'll need to actually reduce their immunosuppression in case they do develop COVID. Now just switching gears and coming from fatty liver to acute viral hepatitis, we know that there are 5 types of hepatotropic viruses, A, B, C, D, and E. A is mainly seen in children and is usually subclinical. That means the child may not even develop jaundice, but has been exposed to A and develops protective antibodies, mainly transmitted through the fecal-oral route. E is also seen through the fecal-oral route, but mainly in adults, and in fact is the commonest cause of chronic and epidemic cause of acute hepatitis. Now, in the immunocompromised, we were again taught that E does not cause chronic liver disease. But in those who have been transplanted and are immunocompromised, it has been shown to cause chronic liver disease. It has also been shown to be transmitted vertically from a pregnant mother to a child. So these are some new findings about E. B, C, and D, I will talk about their modes of transmission in a minute. These 3 viruses can cause chronic liver disease. Now, hepatitis A, just to show you the prevalence, India comes under high prevalence zones in the world. The red marked zones are those with high prevalence, and India is a high prevalence zone. E, similarly, hepatitis E also comes under the high prevalence zone in some parts of Africa, you can see here. Hepatitis B, India is in the intermediate prevalence zone, and the prevalence in India is around 5% of the population. So it's not a small number in absolute numbers, though in the scheme of things, it is seen in a intermediate, it's mentioned in the intermediate prevalence zone. And same for hepatitis C, it comes under the intermediate prevalence zone. 1 to 1.5% of Indian population has hepatitis C. Now, how are these viruses transmitted? If we know that, we may be able to prevent that. Now, coming to the common ones, hepatitis A and E, we know that most of the hepatitis A and E is fecal-oral. And in a fecal-oral transmission, it is usually through food and water. More than food, it is water. And this is one common mode of transmission, sugarcane juice. Sugarcane juice by itself has no problems, but the way it is made with flies sitting on it, flies act as vectors transmitting the virus through the fecal-oral route. We also often tend to use ice, and that can be a problem. Again, the pani puri is a very popular street food, but the water used in the pani puri would rarely be mineral water or boiled water, and therefore can be a potential source of infection, or any raw food lying outside in the market which is eaten should be avoided. Again, as I mentioned, any ice containing things, whether you're eating in a fancy restaurant or having a drink in a fancy restaurant or at the roadside having a gola, I think any ice containing drinks outside should be avoided for the same reason. Now, how are hepatitis E epidemics caused? E for epidemic is an easy way to remember. Most of the epidemics where you see large number of population getting affected is through a mixing of the drinking water with the sewage water. And we often see drinking water pipes and sewage water pipes, or water pipes which are used in the households, and sewage water pipes run parallelly and almost next to each other, and there is contamination from the sewage water with the drinking water, which then this drinking water is supplied to the entire population and epidemics occur. Hepatitis E, especially pregnant women are more susceptible to hepatitis E. So if you have an epidemic, a pregnant woman has to be much more careful about all these things because of her lowered immunity. It has been seen that a pregnant woman compared to any other woman would be at a higher risk of developing hepatitis E, and it would be also more severe in the pregnancy because it can cause fulminant hepatitis. So be very careful, especially in pregnancy. Now, this is to show you that we know that hepatitis B and C, we talk of parenteral transmission, that is transmission through blood, needles, etc. But there are certain modes of transmission which are not obvious, but which are probably common. So I'll just have illustrated them for you to get it fixed in your memory. Shaving outside, common. Intramuscular injections. Dental work is a big source of infections. Make sure when you go to dentist that the instruments have been cleaned between patients, the dentist is changing gloves, etc. And it has been seen that there is also horizontal transmission within the family because hepatitis B can get excreted in the saliva. The child puts a toy in his mouth. The hepatitis B virus can stay on that toy for almost a week, and it can be potentially, and then you have somebody else mouthing the toy and can get transmitted. So it's not only vertical from a pregnant woman to a child, but it can also be from one member, say the father to the child or the father to his brother, etc. So vertical and horizontal, that is referred to as horizontal transmission. Hepatitis C in our country, which we have seen, is mainly related to blood transfusions. We know all bloods, the virus was discovered in 1990, but till 2001, there was no compulsory screening of blood by the blood banks. And therefore, hepatitis C was still being transmitted. And surprisingly, we still see hepatitis C in spite of the blood being screened, being transmitted. So blood transfusion remains a major source for hepatitis C. And in certain parts of the country, like Punjab and the Northeast, sharing of needles and IV drug abuse is also a major source of hepatitis C infection. And then there are other things like tattooing, body piercing, unprotected sex, not using barrier contraception, etc., can also cause transmission of these viruses. So how do you treat? Now, I just want to highlight that there are a lot of fads related to acute viral hepatitis, that you should not take haldi, it will make you more yellow, eat only boiled food, not required. You can eat normal home diet as long as the food is palatable. Hygiene is important. Hand washing has always been very important. Of course, the importance of hand washing has now been emphasized in the corona epidemic, but it has always been very important. So hand wash properly. Take vitamins if your intake is not good, and really major dietary restrictions are not required. And I thought I should make it a point to mention this. CAM is complementary and alternative medicines. There's a lot of focus on Ayurvedic medicines. We're not saying they are bad, but invariably people take Live 52 in randomized control trials, LIV52 has not been shown to be of any benefit. So just to say that we often see under the guise of herbal products, many things are being sold and that can adversely affect the liver. And you can take simple constituents, like if somebody is giving you ashwagandha or, Phyllanthus niruri, guduchi. These are individual components of Ayurveda which are not bad. But when you are given handed over a powder which is unlabeled, we don't know what it contains, you should completely avoid using those. And for hepatitis B and C, there are very effective antiviral drugs. I'll really not go into that, just to say that if there is hepatitis B and C, those drugs can be taken. As I said, regular home food. There's no need for major restrictions as long as the food is palatable and the patient is not too nauseous. Now, this is important. Again, I've got this slide here because most patients are given sugarcane juice as a treatment of acute viral hepatitis, and this should not be done because of the reasons which I told you. Sugarcane by itself is a good instant source of energy. So there's nothing against sugarcane juice. It's just the way it is made. One should avoid it. And boiled food is really not necessary. What you really need to boil is your water. I would say the best source of water is a boiled water. Once it starts boiling, let it boil for 10 minutes and consume it after cooling. That would be the best way to prevent any viral infections. What about vaccines? Now, hepatitis B vaccine is given to all patients with all chronic disorders, especially dialysis. All healthcare personnel and lab personnel should be protected. If there's a hepatitis B positive family member, test the person first and then vaccinate, because there's a 30% chance that the family member may be positive, in which case the vaccination is not going to help and it will give a false sense of security. And anybody who is immunocompromised, like transplant recipients, need to get the vaccine. It is now a part of a universal immunization program, but there are some states still, like UP, Bihar, where I think it is not yet incorporated into the universal immunization program. You are familiar with the doses. It is 0, 1, 6 months. It has to be given on the deltoid, the hand. And there are rapid schedules as well. You want a quick protection, you can do 0, 1, 2 months, or you can do 0, 7 days and 21 days in a situation where you want to rapidly protect the person. But the important thing is this, and which we all are, we rarely do. Once you vaccinate a high-risk population, like you and me, you should test out the antibody titers, anti-HBs, because if you do not mount a protective titer of more than 10, you need to revaccinate with a higher dose. And if you have not checked this titer, you may be again under the false sense of security, thinking that you are protected. And when do you check it? 1 month after you have completed the vaccination schedule. Now, this is again a very common thing. You have a needle stick injury from a hepatitis B positive patient. You often get phone calls for this. What do? If you are vaccinated, there's no problem. If you are not vaccinated, you need to take an immune globulin within 12 hours and start the vaccination immediately. This immune globulin will cost you 45,000 rupees. So it's important that you get vaccinated for reasons which I have told you. If the vaccination is incomplete, you may choose to check your antibody titers, but you need to quickly get these results. If they are low, again, you need to go through this. If you have good titers, then you don't need treatment. So I would urge all of you who have been vaccinated years and years ago, please go check your titers. And if it is less than 1 in 10, get yourself vaccinated again and get good titers. What about hepatitis A vaccine? Now, this vaccine is not a part of the universal immunization program, though the Indian Academy of Pediatrics recommends it after 1 year of age. It definitely needs to be given to all patients of chronic liver disease if they are not protected. So look at the IgG antibody. If it is not present, that means you're not protected, take it. I would say that most children, from 60 to 80%, if you were to test a 15-year-old, you will find, depending on the socioeconomic strata, if it is a lower socioeconomic strata, there is a 80% chance that he has protective antibodies. If it's a lower strata, it's a 50 to 60% chance. Check the antibody titers once the child comes to standard 10, before exams, of course. If the antibody titers are not there or there are no antibodies, vaccinate him then. If the antibodies are there, anyway, the child is protected for life. So this is what one should follow. There are pediatricians who have now incorporated it as a part of their universal immunization program. Most travelers from abroad are advised to take this vaccine because, as I mentioned, hepatitis A comes under, India is under high prevalence for hepatitis A. Now, I'm sure you can recognize these long queues. We recently saw these pictures during the COVID epidemic. We had 2 to 3 days which were given by the government to open up the wine shops. This was, of course, to boost up the economy. Also, many alcoholics were going into withdrawal and were dying of withdrawal, and we didn't want that. Though, of course, that did not seem to be the main reason. So one can see that alcohol really plays a very important part in our lives. You've not seen such long queues probably for anything else. And we also have now a variety of alcohols, what we call IMFL, Indian Made Foreign Liquor, which is available at reasonable cost. So the the interest in alcohol in the country is really growing even amongst our young population. So there are certain facts about alcohol. What is safe? Earlier we used to say you can take 3 to 4 pegs a day and it is safe. Now it has been shown that in Indians especially, much lower quantities of alcohol can cause chronic liver disease if it is had regularly for X number of years, for more than say 7 to 8 years. So what is that safe unit? For a man, it is less than 2 units of alcohol per day, and for a woman, it's less than 1 unit of alcohol a day. And I'll come to the units in a minute. Women tend to, and why this differentiation? Because women tend to develop liver disease with much lesser amount of alcohol compared to males. Now here, the important thing is any kind of alcohol is not good. Scotch whiskey is equal to country liquor when it comes to damaging the liver. And beer and wine are not safe alcohols. There is an argument that it is good for your heart, but really, if one can control the drinking, that is a different issue. But really, one cannot control the drinking. It's again something which has a genetic and an environmental basis as to whether one will become a chronic alcoholic or not. And the double whammy which we have today is you have a combination of alcohol and fatty liver disease, from diabetes, from obesity, which I talked about. So we have patients who are obese, who are diabetic, and are consuming alcohol. So for them, really, it's a double whammy and is a killer. So what is a standard drink of alcohol? So this is 1 unit of alcohol, which is equal to about 8 to 10 grams of pure alcohol. So that is 250 ml of beer is equal to 100 ml of wine and is equal to 30 ml of spirits, which is your whiskey, rum, vodka, etc. So which means that if you are having 1 unit or 1 peg, small peg, most patients when they refer to a peg, they're talking of 60 ml, but when we talk of peg, it's 30 ml. So when you are having 1 peg of whiskey and you are having 250 ml of beer, it's the same. So that's the reason why I said that beer, wine or whiskey is the same, because you're not going to have 30 ml of beer. You're going to have a much larger amount. So it will come to the same number of grams of alcohol that you are consuming. So how do you remain off alcohol? There are drugs, there are various drugs. In liver disease, we abstain from giving disulfiramide. It can cause severe reactions and liver toxicity. So there are drugs which are given for reducing craving, but by themselves, they are not good enough. There needs to be a sustained effort to give up alcohol. And I want to mention Alcoholics Anonymous as being a very effective group, which was started way back in the US in 1935 by 2 people, and they called it Friends of Bill Wilson. They basically started striking up spontaneous friendships with people whom they thought had an alcohol problem. And there's a 12 question questionnaire. If you go to the AA site, I have mentioned it here, where it asks you 12 questions. And some of them are, do you get annoyed when somebody asks you about alcohol? Do you need alcohol as an eye opener? There are many things. Okay. So if the question to having, do you get irritable if you don't get your drink in the day? So if the answer to any of those 12 questions is a yes, then you do have an alcohol problem. Now we have to differentiate alcoholism, which is what they are referring to, from alcoholic liver disease. Alcoholic liver disease is something you develop when you have regular drinking daily over 7 to 8 years, more than 2 units for males, more than 1 unit for females. That is when you get alcoholic liver disease. So you may be having you may be having alcoholism, but you may not have alcohol liver disease. So what I'm trying to say is that this is probably the most effective way. So what they do is they strike up friendships, they discuss. So there are people who have given up alcohol, there are people who want to give up alcohol, and they relate their stories to each other and motivate people who are giving up. There are groups for the family members of alcoholics as well, and that also helps because it helps them to deal with their spouses and tell them how, and kind of in a way facilitate their giving up alcohol. Mumbai alone has 200 centers, and there are about 1250 centers all over the country. And this is one thing I think we are responsible as doctors to communicate to our patients and send them to AA members. They have sponsors who can take up a patient, be in regular touch with them, and ask them to be contactable whenever they have the urge to drink and refrain them from drinking. What about drug use in liver disease? So there are many drugs which can affect alcohol. I'll not go through the list, but I want to definitely specify that if you have a patient with any liver disease, fatty liver disease, if you have somebody with a hepatitis B, C, alcohol, whatever, cirrhosis, there are certain drugs which need to be avoided. So what can you take in a patient who has a need for painkillers? Paracetamol is still the safest drug. Do not use ibuprofen, Voveran, diclofenac, etc. So no non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Many of our patients with metabolic syndrome need to use aspirin for their cardiac disease, but give them under close monitoring, look for varices, etc. Paracetamol, we know by itself can be a killer. It can cause acute liver failure, but only when taken in very high quantities. It's a paradox that when it is taken, up to 2 grams is 4 simple tablets of 500 milligrams of crocin a day. It is safe and the safest drug to use. So that's an important point. Avoid sleeping pills, especially benzodiazepine like alprazolam, etc. Lorazepam and oxazepam are the better ones if one has to use it. Zolpidem can be used. If somebody has a major sleep problem, I find using either Zolpidem 5 milligram or even melatonin 3 milligram as a good substitute rather than giving alprazolam and these anxiolytic drugs. For anticonvulsants, levetiracetam is the safest one to give. For addiction, I did mention to reduce craving, one can use baclofen. We start with a lower dose and then go to higher doses. Important, in those who have cirrhosis, avoid using aminoglycosides like amikacin, and we need to really modify drug doses if somebody has a liver disease. And there are then specific ones for antidepressant also, fluoxetine, escitalopram, and sertraline. There are limits on the maximum dose you can use in the presence of liver disease. Now, I want to make a mention that statins, many patients have metabolic liver syndrome, they will have dyslipidemia, and they will need statins. Statins are absolutely safe and can be used in the setting of chronic liver disease. We avoid statins once they are decompensated with ascites, etc., but otherwise statins can be used. So I would like to conclude by saying that in a patient who has cirrhosis, you should monitor these patients, however stable they may be, however normal their liver function test may be. They need to be monitored every 6 months with an ultrasound and alpha fetoprotein, because they have a higher risk of developing liver cancers, hepatocellular carcinomas, and these may be picked up only early on imaging. We need to avoid IV contrast in these patients, and if we have to hydrate them well. This is a very important point. Avoid proton pump inhibitors. These drugs are used very, very loosely, I would say, so to say, and have definitely been shown to increase the risk of infections in patients with liver disease. And there is no clear indication. If there is no clear indication, any abdominal pain does not mean giving a PPI. Avoid giving these drugs, especially for a long time, because they will increase the risk of sepsis. As I said, avoid NSAIDs and sleeping pills. Even if you have fatty liver disease not related to alcohol, one would generally avoid alcohol once you develop liver disease due to any cause. And very important, vaccinations, hepatitis B, hepatitis A, and do not forget to vaccinate the entire family of any patient who has any chronic disease, not just liver, for influenza every year before the patients start coming in, that is prior to the monsoon, because every year there is a new strain and one needs to get vaccinated. And I think we should also get vaccinated for flu. And there is, I don't want to be very negative throughout the talk. I have been saying don't do this, don't do that. There is something we can definitely do, and that is coffee. 4 cups of black coffee a day has been shown to be very protective for the liver. It has been shown to reduce the risk of hepatocellular carcinoma by 40%, also reduce the risk of cirrhosis to a large extent, and especially in fatty liver disease, black coffee has been shown to be very protective. Of course, it has to be black, not the way we have it with sugar and milk, just plain simple black coffee. With this, I'd like to end my talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aabha. We'll take the questions now. So,
Put a question in chat box.
yes, I'll read the questions from the chat box. The
Yeah.
first question is, what are the drugs for the treatment of fatty liver apart from diet?
Sorry, come again. What
are the drugs used for managing fatty liver besides, of course, the dietary interventions?
So the only drugs which have been proven to be of value, and this is before you have significant cirrhosis, are vitamin E, but again, not more than 2 years. If you take it for longer, there is a higher incidence of prostate cancer. So vitamin E is one, pioglitazone is another, but the problem with pioglitazone is it causes increase in weight, and it actually in a way becomes detrimental. And now there is a new drug, we have saroglitazar, which is used for fatty liver, still not approved for by the FDA, but it is useful especially in those who have a fatty liver with diabetes and dyslipidemia. And there is a new drug called obeticholic acid, which is to be used only as second line if you have significant fibrosis but no cirrhosis. But the side effect with obeticholic acid is that it causes severe pruritus, and it has to be only used in those with compensated liver disease. It cannot be used in those with advanced liver disease. So these are the drugs of proven value, just these. But for all these drugs to be useful, whichever trial you take, the first thing is lifestyle management, and therefore I focused on the lifestyle.
How do you manage a lean person who has fatty liver disease?
A lean person, of course, diet will be still there, but I think exercise is what is going to help, because you are going to, by exercise, increase his muscle mass and reduce his visceral fat mass. So I think exercise will be an important component, especially resistance exercises, as I said, will be an extremely important component in a patient who is lean. But if he has changes of inflammation and fibrosis, he will need the drugs. So we will treat him similarly, except that in him, weight reduction per se. See, even if you see the lean NASHs, you will see that they may have, that's why BMI is not a very good index of fat. You know, you see, I've seen some Africans, they are very well built, they have huge muscle mass and their BMIs are 30. But if you actually look at their fat mass, their visceral fat mass, it's low. So BMI is not a great indicator of fat. You can do what is called a body composition analysis, which will tell you how much of fat is there and how much of muscle is there. What you really need is low visceral fat mass. Visceral means organ mass, which is all the fat which is there in various organs. Liver is an important organ, and now an important organ where they're looking at fat is pancreas. So if you have an ultrasound report coming back as a fatty pancreas, it has been shown that these patients have a higher risk of developing heart disease. So visceral fat mass is what we are aiming to come down on, not really so much purely weight as in the BMI.
So ma'am, there are the interventions where we can bring down the visceral fat mass and increase muscle mass so the weight remains constant, but the body composition changes.
Yeah, that's exercise. That's the main intervention. There's nothing else. Unfortunately, there's nothing else. It has to be exercise.
So there is a patient who has gas problem And when this happens, she feels that the gas comes up and goes. When she gets this, she feels uneasy and feels like having fever. So, what medication should she take? I don't think this is related to the liver
We are
per se, but
digressing
maybe
from
there's
liver.
second.
If there are more liver
Yeah.
questions, we'll take liver questions first, I think. Are there more?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, this is from a member who says, I have a gallbladder stone issue because of which my liver functioning is compromised. I feel bloated even if I eat little. I am not obese and don't consume alcohol. My father had gallbladder stones. What should I do?
Okay, so now it's not directly related, but indirectly it is. So we will take this question. So gallstones are definitely seen at a higher incidence in those who have liver problems. Gallstones and fatty liver disease common. Gallstones and cirrhosis common. So if somebody is having bloating, it is not a symptom of gallstones. That's a one very important point I want to make. Many patients get cholecystectomies done because they are bloating, and unfortunately after the cholecystectomy the bloating does not go away. So bloating is not a symptom of gallstone disease, and the only real symptom of gallstone disease is a typical gallstone colic, which you get with severe acute pain in either the epigastrium or right upper quadrant. And this pain lasts for a couple of hours, may or may not be associated with vomiting, may radiate to the right shoulder. That is a typical gallstone colic. So if the liver functions are abnormal in a patient with gallstones, he's either likely to have fatty liver disease, or you need to look at whether the stone has slipped down in the bile duct and caused like an obstruction, and therefore the liver tests are abnormal. But bloating itself is not a symptom of gallstone disease.
Here they want to know, can you please clarify use of saturated and unsaturated oils? Whether pure ghee is worse than vegetable oil?
Yeah, so that's been a what should I say, matter of debate for a long time. Pure ghee is a saturated fat. Vegetable oils are not, but pure ghee has the carbon atoms arranged in such a way that it actually is facilitatory. It has antioxidants to it, and therefore pure ghee still becomes one of the better saturated fats to have. And of course, one should not go overboard. If you talk to Rujuta Divekar, who's a popular dietitian, she will say that you can have as much ghee as you want. I would say no. 1 tablespoon of ghee is what is recommended as being good and can be had. So if you have to have amongst the saturated fats, pure ghee would be a better thing, better saturated fat to have.
So this member wants to know, if is there a safe PPI in liver disease if one needs to take?
All PPIs are the same. I'm not saying don't take. I am saying that take it only if it is really indicated. When are PPIs indicated? Documented ulcer or acid peptic disease is when they are indicated. Many patients have what they call gastritis, any gas, acidity. The patients use word acidity very loosely. When they have gas, flatulence, they call it acidity. When they are constipated, they call it acidity. So I think whenever a patient comes with a symptom of acidity, don't take it literally. Ask him or her what he or she means by that acidity. And often it is not an acid peptic pain, in which case you don't need to give PPI. And what happens is you may have prescribed it for a month. Patient finds it beneficial, keeps on taking it on his or her own for years and years on end. We know that long-term use can weaken your bones. There's so many side effects related to PPIs. And in liver disease, especially, again, because they have often GI symptoms, they are given PPIs. So one should not just give PPI because somebody has cirrhosis or somebody has varices. PPIs are not indicated. If a patient comes with a varicose bleed, he needs treatment of the varicose bleed with appropriate endoscopic therapy. PPIs are not going to help, only that when we do banding, we may use PPIs for 2 weeks to recover the ulcers which form after banding of the varices. But otherwise, don't use them loosely is what I'm trying to say.
Should we go for fibroscan for NASH patients?
Yes, we should go for fibroscan. Now, unfortunately, in this pandemic, most people are not doing fibroscans. It's not something which is life-threatening and life-saving. But yes, all patients of fatty liver disease should have, especially if the enzymes are high, especially if there's a family history or it's a part of a metabolic syndrome. Because those who have fatty liver disease as a part of a metabolic syndrome, It may be diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, dyslipidemia, thyroid, whatever. Or there's a family history. These are the patients who are more likely to progress to NASH and cirrhosis. So they should have a fibroscan to determine what is the degree of fibrosis or scarring in the liver.
So, ma'am, nowadays, very often we find on sonography reports grade 1 fatty liver. So, how do we deal with this?
So if you have a fatty liver, if the enzymes are normal, I think any fatty liver, just give them lifestyle modification, step one, because finally it is going to be that. Now, if the enzymes are high, you've ruled out other causes, always rule out other causes. Don't assume it is only fatty liver related. Ruled out other causes, then you can ask them to get a fibroscan done. That will tell you the degree of fibrosis in the liver. The idea being that you know where you are starting off as a baseline. It also helps to motivate patients to be a little more diligent about their lifestyle modifications. If you just tell them fatty liver, weight come kar do, they don't take it seriously, you do a fibroscan, you show that there is F3 fibrosis and the next stage is cirrhosis, they will definitely take their weight reduction much more seriously. So I think if you have fatty liver as part of a metabolic syndrome, fatty liver in a family with metabolic syndrome in the family, it would be or fatty liver with raised enzymes. These are the subsets of fatty liver where I would ask them to get a fibroscan done.
So, this person says he has got hepatitis C due to a blood transfusion that he had taken, and he takes turmeric soup every night. So, is that okay?
Well, there are some reports of turmeric. There are now tablets also, curcumin tablets as they call them, capsules available of turmeric. Turmeric we know has good antioxidant properties, but to say whether it will reverse fatty liver disease, we don't have evidence of that. May not do any harm, but I don't know. At least it's not proven in randomized trials that it does good. Let me put it that way. So I think whatever you do, don't do it in excess. So don't go overboard and like have too much of turmeric, So like I know, for example, people take concentrated dudhi juice for diabetes. And we've had patients who come, so they go overboard in taking excess of it. And we've had patients who come with the whole lining of the stomach burnt because of that. So I think whatever is done should be done in moderation, whether it's diet, whether it is these various things, substances which are kind of part of traditional medicine, which are advised to be taken. Don't do it in excess.
On a regular ultrasound, they found that there was an anechoic cyst in the right lobe of the liver, about 1.8 centimeters, with irregular margin. So what is the significance is what they want to know.
Anechoic cyst usually means a simple cyst. The ultrasonologist should be able to tell you whether it's a simple cyst or not, even if it's an irregular margin. If it's not having any echoes, it means there is no sludge in it, no solid component in it. It's to be left alone, just left alone.
Is taking Udiliv 300 helpful?
UDCA has been proven to be effective in very specific conditions. So one is intrahepatic cholestasis of pregnancy. When you have a pregnant woman coming with itching in the third trimester, it can be useful. It is useful in certain cholestatic disorders like primary biliary cirrhosis, now called primary biliary cholangitis. So it's useful there. So there are very specific indications. In children with cholestatic liver disease, we use it. But if you're asking me whether we should use it in any patient with liver disease, answer is no.
Okay, the other question is, when should saroglitazar be started in a patient of NALFT?
So if a patient has on fibroscan, first of all, patient has a fatty liver, has F2, F3 fibrosis on a fibroscan, and preferably in those who have diabetes and dyslipidemia, they may be started on a saroglitazar. Where we don't have much data, it is coming in, but these are the subsets where I would suggest saroglitazar.
Can vitamin E be given long-term in females?
Not more. Okay, you mean because there's no prostate cancer? The studies are not there. So there is no advantage. Most studies are maximum 2 years. So we can only talk of 2 years. See, the thing is, it has a small role. All these drugs are known to reduce inflammation But whether it's saroglitazar, vitamin E, or even obeticholic acid, they are not shown to reduce fibrosis. The only thing which has shown to reverse fibrosis is weight reduction. And that's why I'm stressing on it. That, let's not say that these drugs are a substitute for lifestyle management and weight reduction. Weight reduction still becomes a major part of therapy.
There's a question where they say mother-in-law is 87 years old and she has diabetes, now borderline, not mentioned the levels, and she is a liver cirrhosis patient. So can we give medicine for diabetes?
Yes, of course. Once you have cirrhosis, and if it is an advanced cirrhosis, the safest thing to give is insulin for diabetes. I would not use oral drugs if the cirrhosis is decompensated. If it's compensated, you can use gliptins, you can use metformin. But once it's decompensated with ascites and other complications, I would just use insulin. And one paradoxical thing happens. When you have patients of hypertension and diabetes developing cirrhosis and advanced cirrhosis, the sugars come under control because the role the liver plays in hormone regulation, and the hypertension also comes under control because there is extreme vasodilatation, and these patients actually have low blood pressures. So often patients of diabetes and hypertension, when they develop advanced liver disease, they go off their diabetes and hypertensive drugs. So they seem to be happy, but I always tell them, don't be happy. It's just telling us that your liver disease is advanced, that you now don't need drugs for your hypertension and diabetes.
In the condition of Gallbladder syndrome, the patient also takes 2 pegs of alcohol daily. So is that okay?
Alcohol can increase the bilirubins, but as long as you're restricting to the 2 units and not more, it should be okay. But it can increase your bilirubin. So if you're going for a medical check where your LFTs are going to be done, I would say don't take alcohol the night before. It will show a higher bilirubin.
There is a patient of thalassemia, aged 12 years, with hepatitis C, with moderate iron overload in liver. He's treated with ledipasvir and sofosbuvir, and now the viral load is less than 34. They want to know what care should be taken, and will this affect his growth?
Yeah, so in thalassemics especially, we've had a fair number of patients whom we have treated with thalassemia major. As you know, it's a condition where you need to give repeated blood transfusions every 2 to 3 weeks, and through these blood transfusions, they have developed hepatitis C. So they have to take all the precautions, make sure that their antibody titers to hepatitis B, hepatitis A are there. They may have been vaccinated, but whether they have mounted those titers, if there are no protective antibody titers, they should immediately take the vaccine. Of course, unfortunately, patients of thalassemia are at a higher risk of developing. We've had patients of thalassemia who have been treated with hepatitis C and then again through a transfusion, again developed hepatitis C. So they will need to be monitored. If their liver function tests become abnormal, they will again need to be tested with RNAs for testing for hepatitis C. But make sure that the hepatitis A and B antibodies are there. And if not, take the vaccinations again and take all the due other precautions which I mentioned.
Somebody wants to know of a good liver tonic.
Coffee. I will say coffee, black coffee. I can say that. Okay.
So I think these are all that are relevant to today's topic, madam.
Okay.
Yeah. Dr. Dholakia, do you have anything to say?
Yes, thank you, madam. It was excellent one.